we thought we'd just wrap up with to put Marina in the hot seat, partly. But we have a statement from Michael Pepper, Michael, that I think you're going to read. Michael Pepper was going to be here and was keen to be, but he was called in for a hip operation on Thursday, so obviously couldn't be. But he's sent a little written thing, which is in the papers you have. But I thought, from the point of view of the podcast, we ought to read it out.
Michael writes, I first met Norman after his marriage to Marina, whom my wife and I had known for some time. The first time we met was a revelation to me, as it took place on the Jewish festival of Passover during the Seder service at my house in Cambridge, when both Marina and Norman came along with the Pepper family and other friends. It did occur to me when he came that I didn't know what he did. When asked, with his customary modesty, he mumbled something about being a retired historian. By a remarkable coincidence, this was a very appropriate time of year to discuss Jewish travails, and during our conversation he turned to the question of the protocols and told me that he'd written a book on the subject. I was amazed, as with his self-effacing manner he had not given any indication that he was interested in this area, or that he had written the definitive book on the topic, Warrant for Genocide. I went to my bookcase, where my copy was located, and asked him to sign it, which he was amused to do. I still shudder in horror at not realising I was in the company of somebody who was described by Isaiah Berlin as one of the greatest of all modern historians. Fortunately, as usual, he was very gracious, and then he summarised for me his work on apocalyptic movements. Truly a remarkable discussion to have on the evening we were reading about the slavery of the Israelites and their exit across the Red Sea, accompanied by various plagues which befell their enemies. I wondered later what Norman thought about this story and how it influenced subsequent Western thoughts and movements. Unfortunately, we did not cover the non-religious influence of the Exodus story. Did the undercover of triumphalism in the story stimulate a desire for revenge? It was always a revelation talking to Norman. I recall a conversation with him at the house he and Marina shared in Cambridge, when he said, in a rather matter-of-fact tone, that he had a brother who was killed in the First World War. This was extraordinary, coming at the time when the last British survivor of that war had just died. I imagine that Norman didn't know him, as he was born in 1915, a year or two before the brother was killed. He did say that his father told him that he warned the brother not to volunteer for the army, telling him that you are so slow and clumsy that you will get yourself killed by a shell. And sadly, that was the outcome. As is always the case when immensely distinguished people pass away, there was always a great regret that one didn't ask them more when they were here and could experience the depth of their wisdom and understanding. I will always remember him with enormous affection and respect, and I'm so glad to have met him.
Marina, people will probably have questions, but if I can start. I'm always intrigued, and we've addressed it a bit today, I'm always intrigued that Norman was, in a way, an immaculate Englishman, if an Englishman can be immaculate. But he was very precise and very English. And I was reminded from your interview, Daniel, of his enunciation, which was precise and upmarket and very English. And yet he married not one but two extraordinary Russians. Had a son who writes extraordinary rock novels. Can you explain?
No.
Go on.
But I wanted you to see the other side of Norman. He was a butterfly man. He loved butterflies, and they're all his record when they had a house in Germany.
So this is a book about butterflies Britain and Europe, that he has tracked his own...
Yes, and whatever happened, if he was writing a book or whatever, when he saw a butterfly, he went absolutely like a sort of on a magnet. Sort of how many dots and whatever shades of color, and would register. You see in the middle of the book, once, twice, 3 times, then question mark, maybe. But about Englishness, yes, he was. I do remember when it was weather forecast 10 to 6, the real news, weather news.
Yeah.
So 10 to 6 every day with toast and gentleman's radish. Yeah. And a glass of wine. Ready.
Yes, yes. And then, you haven't finished. And my other question,
I wanted to say something.
Okay, go ahead.
The understatement, English understatement part of it. We were driving in France. I was driving. And he said, absolutely, just coolly, matter of fact, do you find it difficult to drive on a sort of different side of the road? I said, no, it's absolutely natural. And then I realized I was driving.
Marina, I think it would be very interesting for people, not everyone may know your own story, and if it would just be interesting to hear a little bit about your own background in the Soviet Union, and then I have another question, which is how you got to England. But first, do you mind telling us a little bit about your growing up and working in the Soviet Union before you left?
I was working I was a psychiatrist, and I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and I thought I was amazingly clever, that I sort of managed to escape the politics, and I was in a mental hospital, so nothing would happen, and then I realized that they were treating sane, I didn't realize up till then, sane people in psychiatric hospitals for political reasons, because those people were alien to them politically. And when I went to a colleague's ward where one of those people were, I went completely berserk and tried to advertise. Advertise and tell colleagues about the case, but everybody knew apart from me. And then the KGB started following me. That's the story.
But you have a lovely story about them following you one evening after a party in...
Well, yes, it was a lovely story, really.
Well,
in Russia, in my time, there were almost no taxis, and the public transport finished about 11, 12. And Russian parties never finished before 5 o'clock in the morning. So I was walking home, it's quite a long distance, about probably 5 miles, and suddenly this car stopped. And they said, would you like a lift? And I said, yes, please. At the time, there was no crime, it was a police and KGB, and it was absolutely safe. So I said, yes, please. So they drove me home, and when I was sort of going upstairs, they didn't ask my address.
Did it get more sinister than that, in fact?
So they got, you see, the KGB man had to follow me. And they got to dinner, it would be another hour or two. So they called a car to get me home.
But I'm asking, did it become more persecuting than that for you? I mean, what was it that led you to say a bit about what led you to leave and to come to England?
You mean in the car?
No,
to England.
to come to England. I mean, that's a funny story, but I mean, I'm imagining that the circumstances that led you
How
to
I came to England, yes. Eventually, you see, life became very difficult because of the KGB following me. And I became very isolated. The only people who you could get in touch were dissidents. They're not exactly the most interesting people of the whole lot. And I couldn't see friends because I didn't want to bring KGB in their houses. So I decided to immigrate. And I had a lot of publicity in Western press because one of the people, he thought I saved his life. He was a well-known dissident, so he published my name everywhere. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Lord Mayor of Birmingham, no, Manchester, Leningrad were twin towns, sent a telegram on my behalf, and they pushed me out. That's the story. I didn't speak any English. So what you hear is the improvement.
They pushed you out, but they didn't push your son out. Marina, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting, but the other side of that was you were pushed out, but your son remained behind initially, right? And had to be brought out.
Say it again, I didn't understand.
It's about your son who...
Oh yes, my son, yes. My son, you see, the thing was, I divorced my husband because he shopped me to the KGB. But all the same, we had so many years together, I did trust him. When he said, look, you don't speak any English, you don't have any money, go first and I will let him out. But I didn't realize it wasn't him, it was the KGB. So when I came, the first thing I heard that you never get your son out, as a sort of gossip, people say. Anyway, it took 4 years to get my son out. A lot of publicity and a lot of hard work. Anyway, he's a general practitioner in Birmingham.
And wasn't this how you met Norman, in fact? It was over getting your son.
Norman and Vera came to these demonstrations, you see, to help to get my son out. So Norman and Vera stood quite a bit in front of the Soviet embassy with the wrestlers. So it was about 1975.
And Henry Dix, who wrote one of the books in the Columbus Center,
Yes,
was also
and
involved in
it's
the
a
story.
different, it's a professional thing, because and he was one of the people who signed on my behalf at the telegram for the Royal College. And then we started this group called CAPA, Campaign Against Psychiatric Abuse Around the World. And Henry was one of the founder members. He spoke very good Russian.
Because he'd been at school, hadn't he, with your father in
Yeah.
St. Petersburg, isn't he?
Yes, he was brought up.
Yes.
And I suspect he was brought up, I know, he studied in the same school as my father.
I wonder if anyone else has any questions.
Actually, I do. Did Norman ever tell you what he thought about apocalypticism as a worldview? Now, I'm not talking the scientific. Did he think it was, for example, a horrible worldview that led to all sorts of abuses, or did he have any view on it? I mean, he talked about millenarianism and apocalypticism in his books, but what did he think about it personally?
You see, I had this fantastic privilege going for long walks with Norman once a week. And he discussed his next book. So he never discussed actually his personal sort of, when he was writing Cosmos, he was super, I don't know what he got out of me, but probably, I don't know, something. He talked about the book in question.
Thank you.
But with my stupidity, I probably didn't have enough intelligence to ask that kind of question.
I just wondered if he ever said, just offhand, I've been studying this stuff for decades, it's an awful way of looking at the world, or
Yeah.
a terrible way of viewing people and dividing people into us and them in such a radical way. I'm just wondering if he ever made any statements to that nature.
No, I think we are great on the subject. So I don't know.
Okay.
I think he was very concerned, wasn't he, about groups that felt they possessed
Yes.
the truth.
Yes. And any child abused, in the paper, he just really was concerned about it. And when the witchcraft came, he was really concerned about it.
Was he also concerned about animals? I don't know. I mean,
Yes, he has a friend, a dog called Toy. And she was killed
I
in
see.
a car accident.
It's just that he brings out that concern for animals on the part of Zoroastrianism
Yes.
in Cosmos. And it's not something that's usually brought out in that study, but
Yes.
he seems to highlight it. I just wonder if there was a reason with the butterflies and everything.
That dog, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I dishonestly trying to smuggle in a question that I had a little bit earlier. But I think this might be answered biographically. Norman Cohn lived to see the collapse of two ideologies, two great ideological systems, one that lasted for a lot longer than the other, both of which have been labelled political religions. But of course, religions managed to survive disaster, apocalypse, or the failure of apocalypse to come. But what is very distinctive about fascism, Nazism, and communism is that when they collapsed, they collapsed. And it's very difficult, certainly very difficult to find any latter-day Nazis. Well,
Unless you're in the Greek Parliament.
Yeah.
well,
Or Idaho. Is this being recorded? I'm Canadian. You can't prosecute this.
I said that there are some people who might rather mistakenly call themselves neo-Nazis, but I think you know the real thing when you see it, and they're not it. And I wondered whether, having witnessed these, being a personal participant in the destruction of National Socialism and fascism, and then having witnessed the collapse of communism, whether that affected him at all, whether that caused any re-evaluation of the parallels that he had drawn between those ideologies and eschatological movements that were, you might say, called God-based, and which perhaps therefore are fundamentally different.
But it doesn't really collapse, you see. It goes underground, it gets very small. But probably in a few years' time it will get bigger again.
Well,
That's interesting.
That's
Yes, that's a very interesting answer.
Can I just come back to John Arnold's point and your dialogue with him a minute ago? Because I thought it does take one to the crux of the dilemma in Norman Cohn's own work, I think. And I thought, in a way, psychoanalysis poses a sort of question or challenge to history and to other fields as well. But conversely, and I thought perhaps this was also in John's question, that history poses a challenge to psychoanalysis that isn't probably sufficiently met by just assuming that psychoanalysis, that there's a stable sort of human subject across time, so who could be analysed in Freudian terms. There's at least a question about that, isn't there? So when, for instance, your response, which was a very interesting one about the role of differentiating fact and fantasy, I mean, and this is an old debate that goes through the 20th century, I suppose, what happens when you're looking at a very different historical period, when there may have been plausible grounds for something we might regard as a fantasy, let's say sex with the devil, and if you now met a patient with that, came into the consulting room and said, I've had sex with the devil, you might think fantasy or even delusion. Of course, you could think of historical contexts in which that seemed culturally plausible. So I suppose there's a question always in this relationship between psychoanalysis and history and what the one gives to the other, about how much, if anything, one can assume in terms of feelings, of the meaning of dreams, of anxieties, without having to sort of think about the cultural meanings that in a way there in that society.
Sure, but what I think is very important about that is that the fantasies will change according to the context, the historical context, the time, the social context. Those fantasies will keep changing. And that's fantasy with an F rather than with a PH. But the fantasy, the underlying PH unconscious fantasy, is something that is probably timeless. And it's the matching up of a fantasy, an explicit fantasy that is time located, that is historically located, whether it's to do with the devil or whether it's to do with the end of the world by nuclear holocaust, by whatever it is. It's the matching up of those two things. Whether it's what I mean by internal fantasy could be a fantasy about annihilation or an experience of annihilation at a psychic level. It could be something like that, which meets an external fantasy, and that's when it's really powerful. So they will continue to mutate, I think, those external fantasies. One will be replaced by another, where it was a kind of the Cold War, the fears of the Cold War, and the destruction that would be wreaked upon us because of that have been replaced by other fears, perhaps.
I think that's very interesting. Because I think it sort of points as that a discussion sort of leaves open sort of a level of explanation which we haven't really we haven't really addressed today, which is, put simply, why do people believe the things that they do? And one way, which you just expressed sort of extremely clearly and eloquently, is the way explanation is in terms of this match-up between fantasy with a PH and fantasy with an F. But there'd be another way of addressing that problem, which is in terms of how does this belief match up with the other sorts of beliefs that people in society at a particular time hold? What forms of cultural authority come with it? And how plausibly does it seem to explain the world that people face? And to what extent does it give people tools to act inside of it? And even more crucially, what are the alternatives available at any time? Which doesn't rule out these sorts of accounts which you were offering, but it seems to me that we need to hold all of these in play at the same time.
Daniel, you say in your book, I think, that discussing this issue, that states are far more complex than individuals, vastly more complicated. My reaction to that was to think, yes, they are, because states are made up of individuals, and isn't part of that complexity the psychology? And aren't you actually guilty of oversimplification if you leave the psychological dimension out of account?
Michael Helen.
Sorry, John.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say some thoughts. I'm a professor of music therapy, and I've read part of Norman's work, but I knew Norman. And one of the connections that I had with Norman was that he came to St John Passion, and my choir was singing St John Passion. All I can remember is that his penetrating look, and the eyes that I could see when I was singing, and I had to concentrate. I had to sing a solo, and I had to be in the choir. And how that's what I've been thinking about is, first of all, I'm not qualified to comment on his work because academically I couldn't do that. But one thing that hasn't been talked about today, I think, is art forms. And so I was linking up with one thought I've been having is that as music therapists we've spent about 30 years looking at the theories and practice of psychoanalysis and how they can inform the work of being in the room with people who are disturbed. A lot of people who might come from a forensic background, just done a book on forensic music therapy. So maybe I've got something I could say about that. And one of the things is music, for example, and the arts have been very important in history at certain points in terms of sort of crowd and group behaviour. And there's a sort of wave that I don't subscribe to much going on at the moment about sort of the arts and health, and music and health. One movement led by Daniel Barenboim, who's done a lot of work publicly about sort of the arts. And I suppose I'm interested in asking Marina what Norman would have thought about things like the arts and arts therapies in terms of finding another way of thinking about society, because after all, music itself is a very social and psychological and developmental way of interacting. So it was also in response to Daniel Pick, I'm so sorry, because you said, well, where are the structures which would allow such passions free rein in terms of understanding torture? And one of the things that's come out of our book, which is a set of case histories from people who've been in Brampton and Broadmoor and other areas, is thinking about empathy. One of the things that jumps out of the work and through some more scientific research is the idea of mindfulness, mentalisation and empathy, that a musical relationship, literally making music with some people over, say, 4 years, using a psychoanalytic framework, and you can make a difference. And I suppose that, that's enough from me, but I wanted to know what Norman would have thought. No, because he had an affinity with music, I could see that from this connection. But then also I wondered maybe briefly about the fact that I've noticed there's been an absence of mention of the arts and what the eminent historians think about that in relation to Norman's work and these 4 works. And I know he's discussed art a bit, and I know some of the people mentioned her, but maybe it's not the time and place. But I've learnt so much, so I maybe I could answer that question.
Similarly, I also wondered, just in that sort of, what he thought of George Daniel Deronda, because there's probably kind of famous instance of philo-Semitism in English culture, and the valorization of Jewish people, and to sort of a gratitude that Christians ought to feel towards the Jews, and so on and so forth. So we have all these themes around.
We never discussed actually contemporary anti-Semitism because it didn't come to a conversation. But he didn't change his name, despite of not being Jewish, really. But he kept the name Cohn.
I'd just like to ask a question that got raised by the early discussion of psychoanalysis and Norman's apparent late repudiation of it, and what we were talking about a moment ago about explanation. Because I guess if we removed psychoanalysis from the picture, the idea then that there are certain universal human propensities to react to situations in similar ways, such that an apocalyptic worldview would be latent in all human beings and might occur in a vast range of cultures. That idea might be set on one side. And then you might have a view which would say, the apocalyptic worldview was framed in the context of a specific religious tradition or a range of traditions, but it's not universal, or not necessarily universal. They may have spread to other countries or cultures, like to China, late 19th century. Some people said Christianity took it there. To Japan in the 20th century. Some people say science fiction took it there. But it wasn't inherently universal. So it would be historically constructed and therefore contingent. So that if history had been different, if, for example, Europe had not been Christianized, and instead we stuck with Mithraism and polytheism, which historically quite a few historians thought was a realistically possible scheme of events. In other words, what happened wasn't providential, at least not unless they were Christian, which was a series of different events that occurred, which made Europe Christian and therefore preserved in a different form, this apocalyptic tradition. Then the apocalyptic politics about which I and others and Norman above all have written might not have happened. Other things which would be terrible might have happened. For example, you could have still had terrible cases of genocide, and murder, and attacks on populations for reasons of greed and other. But it wouldn't be an apocalyptic worldview, which was framing this just wouldn't be there. And that interests me greatly because I do tend, or whether or not one endorses Freud's theories or Klein's theories, I do tend still to think that there are some, so to speak, species universal responses to situations which can produce certain categories or ways of, I mean, all kinds of different beliefs can be associated with them, secular beliefs, religious beliefs, etc. But they do seem, but on the other hand, of course, we can we think of religious traditions? I think we can, in which there's no element of the apocalyptic. I mean, suppose the universal religion of the human animal is animism, in the sense that all human cultures.
I was thinking of Buddhism, but then...
Or Buddhism,
But there are parts of Buddhism that...
no, there's no apocalypticism in Buddhism.
Well, there are forms of Buddhism where I understand the divine powers...
sure.
There are some Japanese versions, but I don't think in the... I think I tend to agree with you.
Not Buddhism, as far as I know, not Hinduism, no, not Shinto.
Not Shinto.
But to go to your point, John, all three of these religions, at least the populations of all three of these religions, are as guilty of the same atrocities that came out of apocalypticism.
So that's sort of interesting, isn't it? Which is that the question that several speakers began with, how can human beings do things like this to other human beings, can be raised explicitly in the context of cultures which have no apocalyptic element at all. But of course you could then think that maybe still there could be some universal responses that are activated, but there are other forms of partially apocalyptic.
I asked specifically about this question of psychoanalysis, and he said, after some thought, he said, I stand by everything I ever wrote, but I really don't think that psychoanalysis has anything to contribute to the understanding of the Holocaust. I think it was down purely to the efficiency of the German bureaucracy. And I went away and I wanted to have another interview with him because I haven't formulated my thoughts about this. But one or two thoughts came to mind because I wasn't very happy with that answer. And I thought, it presupposes that you're in a culture where you would just be obeying efficiently orders that are given to you. If I imagine myself in that sort of culture, I think I'd have great difficulties in going on with those sorts of orders. And I don't know what this says about me. I wouldn't have been a hero, but I would have found some way, I hope, of not carrying on. The other thought that came to my mind was, and nobody's mentioned it today, is Jonathan Steinberg's book about Italy, fascism, and the half-heartedness, if not obstructionism, with which the Italians responded to the final solution.
When the Bulgarians
Steinberg actually says they didn't go along with it because key figures in the administration, and you're the historians, I don't know if it's true or not, this is Jonathan Steinberg, because key figures in the administration thought it was barbaric. How do you explain those differences? So there is conviction somewhere, isn't there?
It also might speak to, I think, the notions of certain societies which may be conducive to where apocalypticism might take root and fructify. In other societies, I think this is a real interest of mine. Other societies where where there's certain elements that are toxic to the development of an apocalyptic worldview. And if that's true, if that can be demonstrated, then we have. I say we, because we are at the brink. We have to find a way to isolate those elements and make them stick. I feel very strongly about this. Because the alternative is just not something we can bear anymore.
So I mean that anyway focuses, if you want an antitoxin or an antidote, political, cultural or educational, creative, therapeutic to apocalyptic thinking, what it will be or the range of the things that it will be depend on this very question, which is to say whether it embodied, as Norman thought in his earlier work, some Freudian style or Kleinian style, universal propensities to react in particular ways, or whether it's much more contingent. Because then you, if you were thinking of the antidote, there might not be one antidote. There might be two or three completely different ones for different cultures. The antidote in America would be totally different from that in Russia, for example, which seems to me actually maybe quite plausible.
Do you need a sort of grand hypothesis that human beings have a propensity to act in this particular way? Because an alternative could be that what we get from psychotherapeutic work, what we get from psychoanalytic insights, is perhaps a set of hypotheses. Now, there are two areas which are not history, where in fact people have used hypotheses drawn from the clinic. Very valuable. I was thinking of the work of James Gilligan, and I don't know how many people know his work around the table here, head of studies in violence at Harvard, but a forensic psychiatrist and psychotherapist who has run the mental health facility in the Massachusetts prison system for more than 30 years. So his daily experience was to be sitting with people who committed horrible acts of brutality. And the first question he would ask them was, why did you do this? And I remember him talking about this in Cambridge at the Institute of Criminology, and he said what struck him was that time after time after time after time after time, you got the same, exactly the same answer. He or she dissed me, which is American slang for disrespected. And from that, he developed the hypothesis that violence is triggered by the family of feelings to do with shame. Shame, humiliation, mockery, respect, derision, contempt. Now, that's a hypothesis.
But is it a culture-specific hypothesis or a universal?
What he then goes on to do, is what he'll say, he then goes on to look at the statistics also an academic, and he said, actually, this makes sense of the statistics.
In America?
No, in a range of societies across the world and very different societies, to the point where the level of violence that you will get in a society is predictable from the level of inequality in society. And Japan and Sweden are very different societies, but they are very equal societies, or societies with great inequality, and they have low levels of violence as measured in terms of homicide. Other societies, like the American society, have, of course, a very high level because they're very unequal.
To me, one of the really important things about psychoanalysis is that it has moved on quite a way from the psychoanalysis I think that Norman would have been too familiar with at the time. It's gone much further than Freud and Klein.
So you might not reject it now.
And it has taken on board a lot of other disciplines. It's now incorporated elements of philosophy and social anthropology and all kinds of sociology, all kinds of different other disciplines, and it has a different view now. I think it's also far more complex. And Marina's just told me, actually, this afternoon, that his own analyst was a Jungian, which is a particular way of looking at things, and which perhaps generates this idea that you seem. I might be wrong, but I get the feeling you have, of psychoanalysis having certain rather stereotypical.
No. I'm saying why he rejected it.
Right.
Why he rejected
but sort of ideas of archetypes and sort of universal truths.
But on the other hand, he rejected it partly. We've learned from biography because he came under intense criticism for using psychoanalytical, and I give you an empirical hypothesis. If he were here and doing it again, he'd come under the same or even more intense criticism. So the changes in psychoanalysis to make it more complex and less reliant on large general categories such as archetypes or Oedipus complexes or whatever they are, have not diminished the hostility of sociologists and anthropologists and others to it, because there is an intense hostility now to it. So it would still be a live question for Norman if he were writing now. I mean, he might say psychoanalysis isn't what it was, so it's much more usable. But then if he did do that, he would be attacked, probably in much the same way he was attacked.
But it's a huge
guess.
difference.
Sorry?
It's a huge difference, you see, between what David Astor wanted to do, to change, to spook the whole nation.
Yes.
And it's very different from
Very popular.
a psychotherapy, from the one-to-one.
Yes.
I think we should wrap up.
Yes.
Perhaps I
Sure,
could
whether
just-
your chair or me.
I'm sorry, if we wrap up music, Vaughn Williams. I once asked Norman, Marina, check me on this, I hope my memory isn't playing tricks on me. But I asked Norman which music he loved most. And it basically came to great British music of Vaughan Williams.
The music that Norman particularly
liked.
liked. You said Vaughan Williams?
Yes. Subject to the real expert.
I think Beethoven.
And Beethoven.
Another Englishman.
And an English piano. Do you want me to?
Yes, really.
Well, first of all, we've had an enormously stimulating day, it seems to me, and all those who've made contributions are to be thanked. We really are very, very grateful to you, and we're also very grateful to Marina for lending her presence, and to Beck and for Yale for hosting us. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.